Decolonizing the Caribbean is part of the topic. We will have the regular Africa report as well as the viewpoint at the end of tonight's program. And once again, staples like Shabaka Kambon, Reverend Kwame Kamau, and of course Dr. Fergus will be part of the panel, but they're joined by some special guests, ChenziRa Kahina, and of course Dr. Carlyle Corbin among the special guests. So without further ado, let me just join them and let me say very good evening to Reverend Kwame Kamau and Shabaka Kambon.
Yes, good night, Ruskin. How are you?
Hi, Ruskin. Good evening.
And of
And
course,
good evening to the
our
listeners. Good evening to our listeners and
91
viewers.
on Talk City, boy. I miss the studio there at Talk City, Dr. Fergus. I don't know if you do as well, but it was
Yeah,
a lot.
I do miss being in studio, but I don't miss going into Port of Spain.
All right. Well, let me take this opportunity to play special greetings to Vanessa Lillian Herbert, who was there with us, for such a long time on Indaba in studio. And of course, Ruskin has some big shoes to fill there in studio. So all right. So let me turn it over to my brother Kwame Kamau to introduce the program Indaba tonight and tell us what's on the agenda. Let the audience know what's on the agenda here and around the world. I think you're muted, my brother.
There we go. I don't know how that happened, but anything that can happen will happen at any point in time. So I was saying a very pleasant good evening, good night, good morning, depending on where you are tuned in. We want to say a special good night to those tuned in live currently at the Sahel region, Burkina Faso in particular. A very special good night to Princess Aina et al. We want to say, of course, top of the evening to those tuned in the US, those tuned in throughout the CARICOM region, throughout the African diaspora. Welcome to Indaba, the place where knowledge grows, the voice of the Emancipation Support Committee, certainly the voice of the people. I am your co-host for tonight, alongside the what we would call the historic scholar par excellence for the grassroots in Baba Dr. Claudius Fergus, and of course our co-host, a powerful co-host, a man that really needs no introduction in this region. Of course, Brother Shabaka Kambon, activist extraordinaire. In terms of tonight's program, it's really a doozy. We'll be getting straight into the meat of things with the whole process of discussing decolonization in the Caribbean. That's our feature topic tonight. It'll take about 35 minutes thereabout, and we have very power-packed guests going to be joining us on tonight. I want to say a little bit about them before I hand over. And of course, following our feature on tonight, we are going to have an Africa report by Dr. Claudius Fergus and a follow-up viewpoint where we discuss that Africa report in great detail. And that Africa report tonight is, of course, on Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, anti-colonial revolutionaries. Of course, Dr. Claudius Fergus, he has a very special title, and we look forward to that title with regards to the process. Our very special guests for tonight include no lesser persons than the Honorable Dr. Carlyle G. Corbin, as well as my Supreme Queen Mother herself, Dr. And Queen Mother ChenziRa Davis Kahina. So without further ado, I want to invite our very special guests to our Indaba radio program on tonight. Good to have you in studio. Favorably, our guests are gender balance. We have a king on the one hand and we have a queen mother on the other hand. A very pleasant good night and welcome to Indaba.
Good night. Good night.
All
Nice to
right,
be
and
with you.
let's get right into it, folks. We have been set the task of looking at decolonizing the Caribbean. No less a task than that. And so let's start right away with defining what colonialism was for our people, or what it is, perhaps. You may want to say, you might want to use the present tense. But let's look at it before we went. If we look at decolonizing, we have to look at what colonialism was. Who wants to start the ball rolling?
Ultimately, I would have felt more comfortable first and foremost to start at a space where we honor the fact that we talk about control and supremacy of one space of governance over another. So when we're speaking of colonialism, I like to look at it not just as the ism portion, but specifically the policy that really focuses on having complete control over another country or another nation. And inside of these spaces in the Caribbean, especially with the onslaught of enslavement and the onslaught of outright genocidal terror, colonization begins to, in a simplistic form, be that realm where one particular country or nation has complete sovereign control, governance of all of the building blocks of that respective sub-nation, sub-location. And I think it's important that persons are clear that here in the Caribbean, we have many spaces that are still governed by external sovereigns claiming to envelope democracy.
Yes, of course. Of course, when we talk about the Caribbean, we're not talking about one, just to clarify for our listeners, but, the entire Western world sort of consuming the indigenous people of the rest of the world. And the Caribbean being the starting point for that. Dr. Corbin, perhaps you want to come in and join us, perhaps Dr. Fergus as well, to define some of the aspects. What are the main features of colonialism? Dr. ChenziRa has given us the context of it, the broad sense of domination being at the center of it. What are the features of colonialism in the Caribbean?
Yes, well, I would say first and foremost that you take it back to chattel slavery and the emancipation period. And following emancipation, there was over a century of colonialism. So we talk about emancipation, but following colonialism, much of the region went to independence, but the rest went essentially to what we are looking at with respect to colonial reform. So there are different models of that present day contemporary colonial out of the Danish period. Those islands are governed under the U.S. colonial model. You have the British model, which is predominant, but you also have 6 islands in the region that are controlled by the Netherlands. And then, of course, you do have 5 or so controlled by France. And even within the Netherlands and the French models, there are distinctions. So the idea is that, in fact, colonialism is very clearly with us today. We're not in a post-colonial Caribbean, which I often have to make that point when I have my annual discussions with the University of West Indies and University of the Virgin Islands. The idea is that the region is not in a post-colonial world, but much of the region is. And I think that the fact that we don't know much about one another because of lack of information is something that we have the capacity to resolve.
Yeah, so colonialism started here. The modern colonialism has its genesis right here in the Caribbean. Last year, we learned that the Catholic Church, through the doctrine of discovery, was right at the center of the beginning of that process. We know that it starts with native genocide. So it's genocide, enslavement, and that's the enslavement of both the indigenous people and African people. And then it includes indentureship of a number of other peoples from different parts of the world. And then, as you rightfully say, Dr. Corbin, in the post-emancipation period, we enter into a period of separateness and unequalness. It's not freedom per se. And so we have to clarify that. Genocide, slavery, indentureship, and then I like to use the term apartheid to describe that, but Dr. Fergus has cautioned me on using apartheid since it's so closely associated with that most odious form of racism of the 20th century. But certainly it was a state of unfreedom, of separateness, and unequalness. So that's, in a broad nutshell, colonialism. And now we begin to talk about decolonizing the Caribbean. Maybe we could even go one step further and talk about, the degree to which colonialism shaped, if anybody wants to add anything to that, because we're talking about a period of 500 years, starting in the 1490s up to the present. And, most of it dominated, the vast majority of that period under colonialism. What could that mean for people? I mean, I think in terms of, I just want to make this point, there's a study done in Russia by a scientist over there who tried to domesticate a fox. And it took him 60 years to create something of a domesticated fox. 500 years of us underneath the complete control, as you said, Dr. Chen, of another group, would lead to some degree of something akin to the domestication of animals as well. Huh? I don't know if you'd agree with that statement.
Before Dr. Chen responds, I just want to say that when we talk colonization, we should understand that it's a historical phenomenon. It's not peculiar to the Caribbean. It's a historical phenomenon. It's important to understand that. It preceded the Europeans, but even the European colonial enterprise was global. So what happened to the Caribbean, although the Caribbean was the first intensely colonized space, but that experience here also was transferred to the continent, was transferred to other parts of the world. So we are like a brethren of victimhood in this business of colonization. Then we need to understand, I think, taken from Dr. Chen's position, that it's a total imposition on the space, on the people, on the people's mind, and we should not forget, because the ultimate freedom is the decolonization of the mind. So while we may talk about decolonizing structures, institutions, and so on, we will never get to that space that we want to, that ultimate goal, until we address the colonization of the mind. So we need to talk about that as well. Back to you.
Right. So I think we have now established our introduction, and now we could get into this question of decolonization. And we've already, Dr. Corbin and Dr. Chen have already pointed out that we have a number of countries or islands in the Caribbean, you can't call them countries, territories in the Caribbean that are still colonized. That's the first thing. I think the number is actually quite shocking. It's something like 26, is that correct?
Thereabouts.
Yeah, it's a shocking number. When you discover the number, I will try to find the exact number before the end of the program. But the exact number of territories that are still colonized in the region is shockingly high. I just had this discussion with some brothers and sisters from Puerto Rico who are plotting their own journey to independence. So I have a sense of what the experience is like. But so let's get into it, Dr. Corbin and Dr. Chen. When we talk, broadly speaking, what are we talking about now? Now that we've established what colonialism was and how all-encompassing it was, let's talk about what we should be focused on at this time in terms of decolonizing the Caribbean.
Dr. Chen, please.
Essentially, what I wanted to highlight was that, and I wanted to use the example of the Virgin Islands of the United States. And for the listening audience, it's really important to know that while persons are very comfortable saying U.S. first, Virgin Islands, the legal name of these islands is the Virgin Islands of the United States in accordance to the Revised Organic Act of 1954. One of the things is that many persons don't like to use that term that we are a colony. So they have a very colorful phrase, and they use terms like the Virgin Islands of the United States are a non-incorporated, non-self-governing territory of the United States. It just sounds a little lighter than saying you are a colony, and that at the end of the day, there are certain rights and privileges that are not afforded to the persons that make up this invisible citizenry, because citizens are connected to states and or republics and or nations. But when you're tied to a Caribbean island space that is governed by the sovereign power of the United States of America, the shift is in regard to how we deal with education, how we deal with law and jurisprudence, how we deal with economic engagement, how we deal with all the significant building blocks of our social society, economy, etc. And I just need for persons to be really clear. So while it may appear that we have the benefits of being part of the United States of America, the very core of our humanity, the very core of our identity, the very core of our culture is much to be desired. I'll put it in that context. So there's a lot of persons that have moved in the direction of desiring to have some type of a free association with the US because we know that there has to be steps of development to decolonize. And then there are those that just want outright independence, irrespective of the fact that our population is very small, right? It's less than 110,000, right? On all 4 islands, Walter Island, St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John. And then there's those that thought that they could become a state, but don't realize that the United States government never intended for these islands to be anything more than a strategic military space in the center of the wider Caribbean, whether we speak of the Greater Antilles, the Lesser Antilles, the North, the South, etc. But we're geographically in the center. So for militaristic purposes, it becomes very strategic for them to be here and to control here. And I just wanted the listening audience to understand that. So it makes the decolonization process quite difficult. We've been unsuccessful in even securing a constitution for the Virgin Islands of the United States. We've done it 5 times and are in the process of going into the 6th process. And there are a lot of entanglements. There's an issue of identity. There's an issue of nativity. There's an issue of governance in regard to who are we going to be following and listening to. Our relationship with CARICOM becomes an issue because we don't have to, but many of the administrative functionaries and leaders feel that they have to go through the Department of the Interior, the Department of State, and or Congress in order to get permission. Listen to what we're saying in 2024, permission to have more direct relationships with our Caribbean brothers and sisters when we are still geographically in the middle of the Caribbean as a non-incorporated, non-self-governing territory of the US.
Those of us who follow the history of colonialism know that colonies don't exist for the benefit of the people who live there, the natives. They exist for the benefit of the colonizers. So for us, the question is kind of mute about what, the reason that you want to get away from a colonial relationship. But what I have discovered in my discussions with people from various territories that are not yet independent is that there's a significant part of those populations that still want to remain in a colonial relationship. They feel that perhaps they look at some of the other Caribbean countries that have become independent and economic challenges and so on that they face, and they feel they might be better off in that colonial relationship. Even if they sacrifice certain things, perhaps in material terms, they gain something. What would you say to them, and what is the reality of that in your experience, Dr. Chen?
Let me throw in a little perhaps a little kick to that question, and I don't even know if it is fair to ask, but I will ask it anyway of Dr. Chen. So prepare for the question that is coming up. Now, we are still all under some degree of colonization. We understand that neocolonialism is colonialism, but we understand that the Virgin Islands of the U.S. is in a, let's say, a worse situation, a different situation. But Curacao is in a sort of a similar situation to you, and Guadeloupe, Martinique, and the enclave in Guyana that they call French Guyana, Cayenne, French Guyana. Mm-hmm. Could you just do a little comparative analysis for us, even if briefly, in terms of the similarities or distinctions between those situations? I know it is said some 20-something different territories, but it's not 20 something. Different statuses and situations, might be about 3 or 4. So could you just do a little comparison for us so we better understand your situation by thinking about Curacao, Aruba, and Guadeloupe, Martinique?
Dr. Corbin?
Oh, yes. Well, there is a clear distinction, but one can look at the Resolution 1541 of the United Nations in 1960, which recognizes independence, free association, and integration as the three models of self-government. Now, each of these models a minimum standards, and this is where we can then plug in the non-self-governing territories of the Caribbean. There are 6 British overseas territories, formerly dependent territories in nomenclature, and the U.S. Virgin Islands being the 7th that are formally listed by the United Nations as non-self-governing. These are classical colonial territories under different names on the basis of dependency reforms which have taken place over time. You have territories, and the reference was made to the former Netherlands Antilles, which are 6, Aruba, Curacao, and half of Saint Martin, half of the island of Saint Martin, are considered autonomous, but in reality, they are semi-autonomous because they do not have full power within the context of a relationship of equality, of mutual consent. And then you have those that are integrated essentially in our region, the French territories, Guadeloupe, Martinique, Cayenne, French, otherwise known as French Guiana. And then you have the other half of Saint Martin, for example, is another model of semi-autonomy with the French. So we have the largest diversity of colonial arrangements anywhere in the world in such a small space. The Pacific is the counter to that, but the issue is that they're much larger in terms of their space. But these arrangements are non-self-governing. Do not meet the standard of the full measure of self-government. And of course, some are models of Republican models, others are ministerial models. So how it's structured within is another fact, or other factors which come together on how we view them. But in reality, what is common amongst all of them is the issue of the mutual consent is not existing. But what does exist is the unilateral authority of the larger power over the territories.
Dr. Corbin, could you extend to include Montserrat and Bermuda? Because
Yeah.
we tend to think the British is out of this, but the
Well,
British
yeah.
still maintain classic colonies as well, or close to classic colonies in the Caribbean. So could you just extend to include, at least for sure, Montserrat, perhaps Bermuda?
Well, the British have 6: Bermuda, Turks and Caicos Islands, Cayman, Montserrat, British Virgin Islands, Anguilla. Those are the 6 that are formally listed by the United Nations as non-self-governing. They were formerly British dependent territories, and then the British changed their policy and renamed them overseas territories, which didn't change the colonial arrangement, it just changed the title. And there are various, so Montserrat clearly is one of those. And of course, you have, again, the Dutch have 6 as well in the region. 3 that have been unilaterally integrated and annexed, if you will. That's Bonaire, Saba, and Saint Eustatius. Those are the 2 that are up in our region, the Eastern Caribbean. And then you have different models of full integration, at least politically, and that is Martinique, Guadeloupe, and French Guiana. There are
Yeah.
others
Guys,
without
I don't
much
want to, for
time.
our
Yeah.
listening audience, I don't want anybody to miss what we've just heard here. I mean, I'm trying to do the math, and it's definitely somewhere in the 20s.
Yeah.
20 territories in the Caribbean, 20 today in 2024 that are not independent. They have different degrees of colonial status, of a colonial status, but they're not independent. I think that has to be a major shocker to anybody who's listening to this radio program right now. I could just imagine Ruskin in studio right now, absolutely shocked, and our listening audience. So that in itself is extraordinary.
I'd like to give some of the names just again because I'm really clear that while we may focus on the spaces that we are most familiar, but that includes Puerto Rico, which may have the Commonwealth's piece, but still under the governance and the sovereign authority of the U.S. I've already mentioned the Virgin Islands of the U.S., Guadeloupe, Martinique, Aruba, Curacao, Bonaire, St. Eustatius, Saba, St. Martin, and making sure that our people in St. Martin see it as Suliga, like one space, but we're speaking Saint Martin, the Dutch portion, and Saint Martin, the French portion. Again, two colonizers governing those spaces, Saba, Anguilla. Some people tend to forget about Anguilla quite frequently. The BVI, British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Montserrat, Turks and Caicos, and of course, it was already mentioned regarding Montserrat. Bermuda is a different circumstance and situation, and that can be detailed later. And Montserrat. So there, right there, you have a little shy of 20, and we're speaking specifically in this space. We would also have to add inside of our Caribbean space that we have spaces like San Andreas, Isla Catalina, right? That are connected to Colombia as colonies. So it's like really important to because most persons don't remember them. And I think that it's important that we include those when we're having this conversation of what is colonization, what has transpired in these colonial spaces, and how do we best decolonize the Caribbean.
Yeah, very, very fascinating start to this. This is, of course, a broad-reaching conversation that could go on for a long time, I can imagine. But let's drill down now to one of that question that I asked earlier. A couple of years ago, I was in St. Lucia, and I was doing a film project, completely unrelated. And I sat in the office of a minister of government, and he was on camera. I still have the footage. And he said that he recounted St. Lucia's history simply as ruled, I think, 8 times by the French, 8 times by the British. And he lamented the fact that the British were the ones who won out in the end because they got independence. And if the French had stayed in control of St. Lucia, they might be like Martinique and Guadeloupe, and therefore materially better off. And they and he lamented, this is a minister of government on camera lamenting that they were independent. So we do have that kind of sentiment still in the Caribbean. How do you address people like that who and you find there was a poll done in Jamaica some years ago. Of course, that recent polls have shown a real change in that kind of sentiment. But I think it was 2011 where there was a significant part of the population there that felt that they might have been better off under the Queen. So how do we address this kind of sentiment in the Caribbean?
Education, and taking our time to have persons recognize that our humanity is at the center of this particular conversation on decolonizing the region. And again, the world, because what will happen here, Caribbean civilization, and I say it very comfortably, is really at the center. And this facilitates our ability to impact in regard to our relations with the 48 contiguous US. People like to say the upper 50. I'm very specific, however many states, because they have their own internal conflict and are reliving certain areas of their own colonial framework. Yeah. And the same thing in Canada, the same thing in Central and South America, despite our connection with our brothers and sisters on the Caribbean side of these spaces in Central and South America. And of course, in Africa, just as Dr. Fergus so eloquently shared, that this colonization piece, this is global. And the techniques and the strategies and the technique of not just a ma'afa, not like an accidental dismantling of our humanity, but an intentional, institutionalized, long-term, passionate, demonic, genocidal form of terrorism. And we can clean it up and just call it colonization. But it's really a form of genocidal dehumanization of our very core. So
yeah,
it's
I
not.
Think, Dr.
Yeah,
Chen,
I think we make sure we get that point across. I just want to make sure we get that point across.
I think you've answered both questions there. One is you answered the question of what accounts for this phenomenon and the way out of the phenomenon through education. Dr. Corbin, Dr. Fergus, Reverend Kamau, would you like to add anything to that?
I would like to jump in here and certainly thank our guests for such a powerful program thus far. All the contributions are absolutely on point. My question, my interrogation has to do with next steps. Because to one extent, there are those who are saying perhaps we're better off within the colonial construct because they're thinking about visas, they're thinking about access to colonial constructs, again, based on miseducation. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery, none but ourselves can free our minds. The words of the most honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, immortalized in song. So clearly, there's education that is needed, that is necessary. I'm thinking now about the activists. There are activists in these various territories who are looking at this very important question, and they are interrogating next steps in terms of what do we do or what can we do, not only as individual activists, is my question, but as a Caribbean region to help to facilitate not only the status change, but more important than the status change, a true sense of self-sufficiency and self-determination and absolute sovereignty within the Caribbean. So again, as activists and as a Caribbean region coming together, what are our next steps? What would be the strategy that you would suggest, either one of you, in terms of one, how do we achieve this? Not only from a status change perspective, because many of us have changed status. My Rastafari brethren, salute to Rastafari, would say, we have a flag, we have an anthem, but more than that, we don't have. And so we want for our brothers and sisters who are pursuing this activism to get more out of the exchange and experience than we did in some of these so-called post-colonial territories. Could you speak to that? What are the next steps and how do we ensure that self-determination, sovereignty, self-sufficiency within an within an Africanity, an African cosmological frame of reference, how do we achieve that?
Well, I would say that certainly what Dr. Chen has mentioned, education is very important. We have to know more about one another in the context of our political evolution and levels of political evolution. It was mentioned that there are people who are fine with the colonial condition. I refer to them as the colonial accommodationists. And it's often the case that these accommodationists are in political leadership in many of these territories. So the activists who are seeking to move forward out of that colonial condition have to essentially go up against the framework, the mindset that the current condition is fine. And certainly from a period of 1983, the independence of St. Kitts and Nevis to today, that's over 40 years since the last country has become independent. There's been an entire generation of people in their 40s, if you will, and certainly late 30s, who are all within the frameworks of the governing of their country. So they don't have the experience of colonialism. They see it in the past tense. So this is one of the challenges we have to face. But certainly, I think it was Julius Nyeri who said it's better to govern or misgovern yourself than to be governed by anybody else. I think that is a key mindset that we have to try to inculcate within the framework of our people.
Yeah, and while we're having this discussion, I think that we might have missed something significant. It just dawned on me. But there are several territories that are independent, but still maintain the queen and now the king as their head of state, which is, a kind of a strange relationship to, the former colonial powers. That is also a factor. And then there, of course, so what do we say about them? And then, of course,
let me I think we should go into that direction, but let us round up the the previous segment that we have been addressing in terms of the colonial status. Now, I want to address this question to Dr. Corbin. Just over 10 years ago, there was a very powerful anti-colonial, anti-French colonial movement in Guadeloupe, a little less extent in Martinique. Now, we know that these countries are the homes of most radical thinkers, most revolutionary thinkers, like Fanon, Césaire, and so on. That legacy is still there. It still informs whatever anti-colonialist activism that comes out of those two territories. Now, I was in Guadeloupe at the time, and I remember that Professor Millett had asked me to check in on the status of what was going on. I was very disappointed that the French had seemed to be successful in crushing that movement. Could you speak to that a little bit before addressing Shabaka's question? I remember that in relation to the statement that Shabaka made that in St. Lucia you have this dilemma with colonialism, but on the other hand, in a colonized space as the Francophone, so-called Francophone territory, there is in fact just the opposite. There's a significant activist movement to get rid of France. Could you speak to that a little bit first?
Yes, yes, you're correct, sir. There is a very strong movement. It has historically been, and of course, at the same time, the French have been most adept at portraying their model of colonialism in the context of assimilation. So you have that major challenge. In addition to that, if we look at the demography of or the demographics of those three places, certainly Guadeloupe, Martinique, you will find a disproportionate number of French settlers. You find this in the Pacific as well. New Kanaki, otherwise known as New Caledonia, and Maui Nui, otherwise known as French Polynesia. You're finding it to the point where the populations are almost equal in terms of the local population and the settler population, and this has significant impact on any sort of public or affirmation of change of status. So, and of course, the other issues arise with regards to the ability to migrate, but that's also, as we know, in the reverse as well. And so you find that this is one aspect that we don't see quite often because we're not looking at it as much as we might. The idea that there's a population change, there's a demographic change in the region as a result of this, and was being done quite quietly, but we're seeing it. This is an area that, at the same time, there are movements within those territories. Certainly in Cayenne, and I'm very familiar with a number of persons who are involved in those areas in varying degrees. In fact, in Cayenne, there's now a representative in the French assembly. In fact, pro. You have movements in that of to age them because they are often isolated. And there, of course, as Dr. Chen mentioned earlier, the dependencies of developing countries in the region. And we have the case of San Andres, Providencia, Santa Catalina, which are in fact dependencies of Colombia. So how do you address that? And then, of course, how do we address the wider picture of 40 years of dormancy and independent states having been able to develop economic ties, technical links with those same countries that remain colonial powers in the region. So when the territories begin to change their approach and move toward political and economic evolution, what is there a conflict there? And that's just something that we have to look at. But of course, CARICOM has been doing a number of things with respect to bringing in territories in observer status capacity in the past, and looking at associate membership in some instances currently. And OECS, Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, has been doing a similar thing. And of course, ECLAC, through which is the sub-regional headquarters in Port of Spain, has been primary in this arrangement for quite some time under the umbrella of the United Nations.
Yes. Fascinating stuff, Dr. Corbin. Thanks for those insights. One of the interesting things that we see, and I think I'm not sure. I think we have to look at moving to the next segment now. So I think we're going to have to leave that conversation there. I want to get some closing remarks from Dr. Corbin and Dr. Chen on this subject. But this is something, I mean, we could go into so much more on, and we could do another hour of a program on this subject. It's a fascinating subject, and I think it really deserves some more time in the Caribbean space. But Dr. Chen, Dr. Corbin, what would your closing remarks be for tonight? Of course, we're gonna. I'm suggesting that we have another program like this sometime in the near future.
I wanted to really share that when we're talking about colonization, that it automatically lends itself to this conversation we have on decolonizing the Caribbean through a lens of reparatory justice and reparations. So I just wanted to add that it's really essential for us to navigate very carefully and very respectfully, but very directly and clearly on how we're going to address the implementation of the colonial protocols. And I think I wanted to just kind of highlight that, how it deals with sustainability in regards to the restoration of life, the restoration of respect, the restoration of security, and that it allows for this reparatory justice movement language to shift so that it is inclusive, very inclusive in this particular region. While we may be coming from a very Pan-African grounding, or more correctly, a global African, indigenous, native grounding, that we really understand that we have to integrate culture, wellness, technology, education, the arts and the sciences that govern the universe. And I wanted to just make sure that I took a moment to extend an invitation on March 26th from 10 a.m. There will be some information coming from the Caribbean Pan-African Network, where we'll be having another layer of a more extended conversation and dialogue around Caribbean non-independent spaces.
Powerful. Thank you.
Dr. Corbin?
Yes, just briefly, certainly education is quite important for us to integrate the plight of the non-independent Caribbean within the framework of the discussion about the evolution of our region. The region has to be able to embrace that within the framework of the reparations movement as well. And in particular, the fact that the colonialism is not over, it has just taken on a much more complex dynamic. And until we have to solve this in order for us to come together in a broader context.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you very much, Dr. Chen, Dr. Corbin. That's the time we have for this segment tonight. And we will see you guys again soon. Of course, I know that our listeners were edified there. Those who would have paid attention to that segment would have definitely been shocked and learned something new tonight. Dr. Fergus, I think it's time for the Africa Report.
Indeed, indeed. And you would see the connectivity with this. I am sorry that they had to go, because it would have been good for them to share their views on the Africa Report as well. Rene, bring up that report for us, please. Let us get right into it.
May 1963, Kwame Nkrumah famously warned African leaders of the ever-present danger of neocolonialism. The occasion was the signing of the protocol to establish the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa. In his commemorative book, Africa Must Unite, he appealed to Africans to be extremely vigilant in scenting out the subtle and insidious infiltrations of neocolonialism. This edition of the Africa Report looks at the ongoing efforts of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, to emancipate themselves from French neocolonialism in all its forms. Because the path chosen is military, ECOWAS responded with immediate suspension of the three Sahelian states, in addition to harsh sanctions against Niger. By doing so, ECOWAS has become France's best ally, willingly or unwillingly. Undaunted, the Sahelian states formed themselves into a confederation, the Alliance of Sahelian States, or AES for the original French, Alliance d'État Sahélien. By the way, the Sahel is the transitional zone between the Sahara Desert and the Savannah Belt to the south. Except for Guinea, all France's colonies in West and Central Africa got flag independence in 1960. Nkrumah's message was peculiarly relevant to them all. France never really gave her African colonies political independence. Even to say flag independence is an understatement, because it was actually a transition to an extreme version of neocolonialism, crudely disguised as the Colonial Pact or Cooperation Agreements, which the French compelled the new leaders to sign before handing over the government. Included in this pact were the following conditions. The African countries must repay France the cost of all infrastructure built during the colonial era. They must deposit 85% of their foreign reserves in the French treasury and retain the colonial currency, the CFA, which must be printed in France. France retained the right to exploit all the natural resources in these countries. France also reserved the right to supply equipment to the military and the right to deploy military troops in times of crisis, which the French themselves might instigate. French must remain the official language. They must not have military alliances with any other imperial power but France. And in the event that France goes to war, they must come to the aid of France. France's imprisonment of the CFA has played a major role in maintaining economic dependency on France. In 1960, Guinean President Ahmed Sékou Touré decided to issue a national currency. France would have none of that and dispatched secret agents to flood the country with fake banknotes to destabilize the economy. The French systematically destroyed or sabotaged everything they built in Guinea before they left, simply because Guinea rejected the continuation of French control. Few commentators have described France's arrogance and wickedness more eloquently than Pan-Africanist, anti-neocolonialist, and legal luminary Professor P.L.O. Lumumba of Kenya.
They were harsh because their very survival depended on these colonies. And their harshness can be seen when on the eve of independence in African countries, they signed the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. The yes-no vote for French colonies to decide whether after so-called independence they would retain connection and connectivity with Paris. They gave everybody the opportunity to vote yes or no, but they did not want you to vote no. So that when Guinea voted no under Ahmed Sékou Touré, when they were leaving, they destroyed everything that was capable of being destroyed. Modibo Keïta, in what was then the French Sudan, now Mali, they destroyed everything. Algeria, the pogrom in Algeria, when they were leaving, then led by Ahmed Ben Bella, they destroyed everything.
Only a few African countries have dared to openly reject French domination. We have already mentioned Guinea. In 1961, Mali joined a political union comprising Mali, Guinea, and Ghana. In 1983, Upper Volta, as Burkina Faso was then called, made headline news as Army officer Thomas Sankara assumed the leadership of the anti-French resistance in Africa. Under Sankara, Upper Volta underwent a true revolution toward genuine independence, even changing the name of the country to Burkina Faso. It is well known that France sponsored his assassination 4 years later. The immediate trigger for the current revolt against France was the suspicion that the thousands of French troops in the Sahel were not serious about fighting jihadists and secessionist groups besieging these governments. Although all three Sahelian leaders share a genuine revolutionary curve, I would say that Captain Ibrahim Traoré is the most revolutionary, most progressive, and most charismatic. Traoré sees himself as the political reincarnation of Thomas Sankara. Coincidentally, both men assumed the leadership of the country at the same 34 years of age. Let's hope that Traoré outlives Sankara as captain of the ship of state. All three countries have similar decolonizing programs. They have all rejected French as the official language, while elevating their native languages to official status. They are currently discussing a new currency to replace the CFA. They have cancelled the colonial pact that kept them in colonial bondage. In under 2 years, Ibrahim Traoré has made great strides to reverse the underdevelopment written into the colonial pact, which he likens to enslavement. Like the great Toussaint Louverture, he declared,
Aujourd'hui, nous sommes confrontés depuis plus de 8 ans à la forme de manifestation la plus barbare, la plus violente du néocolonialisme, de l'impérialisme.
for more than 8 years, we have endured the most barbaric, the most violent form of neocolonialism and imperialism. We endured slavery, but our ancestors taught us one thing. The slave who refuses to revolt against his master does not deserve any pity. Among the many transformations is a revolution in transportation infrastructure, including a new international airport and several new highways. In his thrust for food security, he has revolutionized agriculture through irrigation, providing farmers with improved seeds and fertilizers, scientific training, new access roads, marketing, and storage. He is about to complete the Samendeni Dam to provide irrigation and improve the supply of electricity. His government is partnering with a local entrepreneur to build a gold refinery, and much more. PLO Lumumba debunks the view that the Confederation's exit from ECOWAS declared last month is a blow to African unity. To him, it is a catalyst towards genuine unity.
Pan-Africanism does not mean that you swallow poison. Pan-Africanism means that you engage in activities that enhance the spirit of Ubuntu and Pan-Africanism in a sustainable manner. So it is true that this is a bold move.
Niger's revolutionary leader, General Abdourahmane Tiani, demands that France pay reparations for the 107 years of pillaging his people.
There is no longer any question that our states are the cash cow of France. France has robbed us for over 107 years. France must pay in cash debts of 65 years of systematic plundering of our resources and an extra 42 years. We will find a timeline so that we can be even with France.
All true revolutionaries know that the revolution of the mind is the most critical index of a successful revolution. All the revolutionary leaders have redefined the education system away from the colonial curriculum. They also have robust public education agendas. The efforts are already paying dividends. Let's conclude this edition with the voices of two young Burkinabes who have awakened to a new sense of their African identity.
He's talking about a period before even the colonials came to Africa. That is the history we need. We need to talk to learn about Mansa Musa. We need to learn about the Songhai Empire, the Mali Empire, the Wolof Empire. We need to learn about those things. Then we come and learn about slave trade. Who stole our people and took them to the Caribbean and the United States and Brazil and South America? We need to learn about colonialism. Who these people who came and killed our people, took our land, took our minerals. We need to learn about neocolonialism. And with this knowledge, we will know how to relate with these people, and we will know who is a puppet. Like Ibrahim Traoré says, you need to learn and understand who is a puppet, who's a sellout, and who is a house slave.
Yeah, otherwise.
So that's your Africa report for this week. And as I said, it ties in very, very neatly with the prior discussion that we have had. And Dr. Chen is so right that the reparations movement is in fact part of the decolonization of any region. We must speak to the question of reparations. And that's why I made sure that question by General Chiani is included in this report. They are connected. So all of the other facets of decolonization, but reparations. We must speak about reparations. Over to you, my brothers.
Well, first, let me just say that it was interesting to hear our brothers on the continent talking about the house slave, the phenomenon of the house slave. Trying to find the language to describe those people who operate and act outside of their own interests. Very, very interesting. Puppets, house slaves, Negroes, etc., etc. These are some interesting. It's hard to define this group that operate and act against, not just outside, but against their own interests. Very, very interesting thought there.
Absolutely.
Mhm. Go
If
ahead,
I may
Paul.
join in really quickly, your masterpiece of a program. Congratulations again for yet another masterpiece. Delved into so many different areas. The dependency of Europe on the mineral resources and assets of Africa, the extent to which they are willing to go to maintain that by force, by fraud, by fiction, uh, and otherwise. Certainly, the diversity in terms of moods of Africanity. On the one hand, there is a move towards a type of union where we speak to unity that does not empower, that does not give us the tools for self determination. But then on the other hand, we find these revolutionaries, these Sahelian revolutionaries, coming forward and saying no to that older model, more popular model, and taking steps towards creating and forging a path that is not new, by no means new. I call Captain Traore Captain Africa. For me, he is Captain Africa. He represents all that we want Africa to be, all that we want Africa to accomplish. Not only in terms of ensuring that there is more peace and safety and security as they get rid of Al Qaeda and other insurgents in Burkina Faso, but also by way of the overhaul in the education, by way of what we are seeing in terms of the mineral assets, the gold, going in the direction of processing. So you are selling now dorbars and bullion versus just the raw form of it. And all of the other things being done in irrigation, in agriculture, it really sets the tone for all of the other nations to follow too. But the question for me, Dr. Fergus, is because of the fact that the Sahelian revolutionaries are very military. They have the backing of China on the one hand. They have the backing who supply them with some of their equipment, military equipment, etc. They have the backing of Russia on the other hand. Do you believe that other nations can follow suit and dare to take a hold of their self-determination without that sense of militarism, because they have been persecuted, they have been called all kinds of names for their military stance. Many of them came to power by way of a revolution, and many have it to say that Africa shouldn't go in that direction. We need stable, democratic forms of government. And so they've come under a lot of critique. But could we, by way of the ballot, achieve that which these very brave men are proving that perhaps may need the bullet to achieve?
Kwame, even if these men were civilians, the ballot would exclude them from any opportunity to govern the country. We see what happened to Malema, for example, in South Africa. That's a good example, right? So the military is, in fact, one of the avenues. I'm not promoting military rule, but I'm fully aware too that electoral politics in West Africa is as close to fraud as you can get in many of these countries, right? Where they preserve the status quo, they preserve dependency. It is a mechanism to do so, right? So the military also, if you recall, in the 1970s, it was military men that actually founded ECOWAS, So it is not that the military cannot be progressive, and a lot of the progressive rulers were in fact military men, right? We see in Ghana, Jerry Rawlings, for example, was a military dictator at one time. He entered into civilian politics, and he was one of the most dynamic rulers since Nkrumah, right? There are two men that Ghana remember in terms of the decolonization process, and that's Nkrumah and Jerry Rawlings. And Nkrumah, I think, symbolizes what could be done as a civilian. But that was the first generation of leaders, and they proliferated across Africa. And Lumumba, the original Lumumba, Patrice Lumumba, Nyerere. These were all sterling rulers who did not care about accumulating wealth for themselves or their families, but about development. And it is that kind of inspiration that you see inspires actually that kind of leadership that inspires a person like Traore. Do you know he has never taken a presidential salary? He continues
He
to take
maintains
a
his captaincy.
soldier salary. As a Thomas Sankara, Nyerere, these men died virtually poor, you can say. Whereas many politicians in West Africa and other parts of Africa see politics as a path to personal enrichment, empowerment, self-aggrandizement. It's a very good question, but it is difficult, really difficult, because of the political culture that exists today. And perhaps it is through genuine revolution, as we see in the Sahel, that you can have that kind of transformation and then perhaps return to civilian rule.
I just want to highlight a few comments
There's
here.
another question.
Just a few comments, if I may, just to bring the live audience in. Thank you so much for joining us here on Clark, Cecile Johnson, Afua Rada, etc. Reading Afua first. She says, "Greetings. All what is being done to protect him so he can accomplish his destiny of African people, especially those who are French controlled. He needs to be protected. The enslavers are not sleeping." That's the question of protection. And then
Let me come in right there, because that's the question I was about to raise.
go ahead.
The question of the nature of the imperialist environment in Africa is one that is deadly, and perhaps if any of these leaders were civilians, they may not be alive today. This is a real, we look at the history of these spaces.
Between exile and execution, it has been the order of the day.
To take on the amount of resources that those who have benefited from the previous system stand to lose. We understand what's at stake, and Dr. Fergus, in his own presentation, questioned or hoped that these leaders could survive longer than some of their predecessors, and perhaps if they were not military, we wouldn't even be having this conversation today. We'd be lamenting their passing.
Yeah, but let's not be sentimental at all. You're quite right, Shabaka. Some of the greatest revolutions were in fact led by military men. The United States Revolution, the revolution was led by military men, right? The Haitian Revolution, it was enslaved people who became, military men. General Toussaint, a military man, and one of the greatest, most profound constitutions ever written came out of Haiti. It was military men.
Yeah, and I'm saying, Dr. Fergus, when the stakes are so high,
the French Revolution itself, Shabaka, was founded upon the Jacobin War, military people, and they expanded the revolution.
And the point I'm making is that where Africa is today,
let's not be skirmish about military leadership.
But
you're right, they may not survive.
The stakes, it's when the stakes are so high, perhaps at that stage, the military intervention is necessary, because the stakes are so high for both the status quo and the new nation that they're trying to bring into being. The stakes are so high that it would need some form of protection to survive. That's what I'm saying. I'm just looking at history and saying, I wonder, if it is possible when the stakes are so high for there to be a genuine revolution through the ballot box, so to speak, with
and
civilians
and
at the helm.
and boots on the ground, not only military boots, because it's a mass movement as well. It's a
Yeah.
massive civilian masses that drove the French from the embassy. It drove them out. It was not the soldiers, it was civilians, men on the
And that's
ground.
that's one of the beauties, I think, of the Sahelian revolution, that it was so wondrously popular. They couldn't use propaganda and their machinery, which is global in its reach, to claim that they didn't have the popular sentiment and perhaps pull a Gaddafi, so to speak. They came out in their numbers. They were loud. They were proud, and with fists in the air and chants, swelling their ranks by the day. Women came out, children came out, men came out. So there was no way that you could claim that this was not, as you said, boots on the ground in terms of a populist sentiment. And I want to turn to Gion Clark, and she's making the point. We are in the age of enlightenment. The youths of Africa are the beginning, or they are being emancipated from mental slavery, she says. That is what shared experience from the diaspora with the continent does. In terms of us coming together, sharing our experiences, sharing our knowledge, filling those gaps. I don't want to say much, but I do know. I'll just give a little hint that there are people in the diaspora who are already partnering, I can tell you confidently, with the Sahelian groups to bring about productivity, trade, manufacturing, etc. There's a hand extended to the diaspora to come and to participate in the patrimony of Africa. And again, we have to defend them, we have to protect them, we have to keep them safe. But beyond safe in the sense of the militaristic safety, but safe from the perspective of if they are boycotted, if they are banned, if they are sanctioned, the BDS, boycott, divestment, sanction, then they are going to need markets that they can sell their products to. They are going to need economies that they can trade with, that they can build with. They would need science and technology and that type of transfer. What are your thoughts in terms of the Africa diaspora coming together and the new frontier that we have through this Sahelian movement?
Well, I think you have some insights into that that I don't have, but I know it's happening. And unfortunately, I think the Caribbean isn't strong enough in doing so, right? So we need to look at that as well. Okay. There's a point I wanted to make that just about slipped me as you asked that question there. So, yeah, but that is important. It's very important. I now remember. One, a great victory had been achieved just this week in that the sanctions, ECOWAS had to lift the sanctions. So that's a
Yes.
great victory for them. Okay. Now you see the popularity of the leaders, as you mentioned, where Traore, he moves, and I show that picture, he moves around the masses, and you don't see a whole band of soldiers around him to guard him, to protect him. In fact, civilian presidents have more protection around them than these military leaders have. They move among the masses all the time, without any heavy security. Of course, they must have the means by which they guard against any, assassins that might be hired from, particularly, from these imperialist countries, right? Because we know they're gunning for them, and attempts have been made on the life of at least Traore, done not so long ago. So these are developments I think we need to be proud of. We can look forward. Now, they declare that they are not going back to ECOWAS. So that's something we need to look at. They insist that ECOWAS is counterproductive in terms of decolonization. So they're not going back. However, ECOWAS has in fact, conceded their right to rule in their own way. These are sovereign states, and they had no right to impose sanctions. In fact, I think the sanctions are not even constitutional within the ECOWAS framework. You know, they do it, but I don't think it's constitutional. So they successfully challenged that. They lifted the sanctions, most of them, so we can see even more development now. You know, without that burden on their back that ECOWAS, their own brothers are gunning for them as well.
Shabaka, your thoughts?
I'm what brightens my heart today is the optimism that Dr. Fergus, who has done the research, has come away with. I mean, I respect his informed opinion deeply, and having looked at the situation carefully, he has come away with a sense of optimism that he's been able to convey to us and to the listening audience. And that is really important because, of course, seeing the sanctions that were imposed by ECOWAS and the kinds of statements being made there, knowing the history of manipulation on the continent from outside forces and so on, one would be concerned before declaring a sense of, solidarity. It takes a while for us to be sure that this is something that is in the interest of African people, genuinely. And so for me, it's very positive that Dr. Fergus has been, having done the research, has come away with such a degree of optimism about the future of these countries.
I have a question.
I'm optimistic, but I'm not unmindful that they would continue to destroy the revolution. Once you have revolution, you have counter-revolution. Unfortunately for colonial states, much of the counter-revolution comes from the former colonial powers themselves, But Fidel Castro had to face throughout his life attempts of assassination to end the revolution. So we cannot assume that there would not be attempts to end it. But if these men succeed, we would know that 2020s is not 1980s, when eliminating Sankara was the end of the revolution, because the counter-revolution would have succeeded, under Campore. But the 2020s is a different kind of enlightenment. It's a new kind of enlightened mass movement that could
groundswell.
Yeah, that could see new leadership rise from among the masses as well, because they understand the oppression that France would have had them into, their ancestors themselves. Look, they said Niger is now one of the fastest growing economies in Africa. One of the fastest growing. And the label they have put, the Western media have put on Niger, poorest country in Africa. Now it's the fastest growing because they have taken control of their economy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I when I look at this, I think of Venezuela right away, and we saw a military leader there in the form of Hugo Chavez Frias take control of the country. And Venezuela immediately, all the indices for development went up once he had, begun to use the resources of the country for its people. And then we begin to see the international community, quote unquote, taking a particular approach to Venezuela, which then brings the indices back down and leads to mass migration out of the country. So it's a very interesting, it's going to be very interesting to see how these countries deal with the imperialist forces that will no doubt, if they are genuinely revolutionary, as they appear to be, if there's no doubt that the imperialist forces will frown upon those countries in very material and real ways, as we've become accustomed to.
Closing remarks, Dr. Fergus?
Yeah, I would just say that true revolutionaries are also visionaries, and we can really look forward to transformation, not only of the Sahel, but if they succeed, you would perhaps and most likely gradually see the expansion of that alliance not only with Francophone countries, but perhaps from the surrounding the surrounding region as well, like Nigeria, Ghana, perhaps Liberia joining such an alliance because they also have neo-colonialist issues. Their economies are not completely under their control. So why they may not be in as bad a situation as France, the situation isn't one that we can say that they have achieved full independence either. So we need to hope that that alliance succeeds and that it grows. And I think Malema quite rightly see it as the future of Africa. We know Malema's views, and he has constantly expressed support for this alliance and see the hope of Africa in the future of this revolution.
I think to close, for the sake of our listeners here now, I think we need to point out, just to bring the whole program together, that when we look at the international political economy, we see far more continuity than change. We see the system that was established during the colonial period and cemented there afterwards still functioning within the logic of white supremacy, and so there's a long way to go. Still a great deal of struggle to achieve a greater level of equality for all people across the world.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. We certainly want to recognize our Facebook and YouTube viewers at this time. Princess Anika Yina of Burkina Faso herself, Stormy Gordon, Cecile Johnson, Gayon Clark, Afua Rudder, Bakari, Makeru, John Albert Johnson, Shekamet et al. Shekamet made a point, and I want to read the last line of it because we are out of time. Start from Sankofa and bring it to the modern day. We certainly would like to thank our special guests on tonight, Doctors Carlyle, Corbin, and of course, my Supreme Queen Mother herself, Dr. ChenziRa Kahina Davis. We certainly salute them for the time that they've spent with us dealing with the issue of decolonization, which then took us to the Africa Report. And now here we are closing off with the viewpoint on tonight as we zoomed in on Mali and Chad and Niger, and of course this Sahelian revolution, so to speak, that is taking place now. One that is not just boots in terms of military, but one that is boots on the ground. I'm borrowing that phrase, Dr. Fergus, in terms of the groundswell of the people, a true mass movement, a collective of the people that cannot easily be quenched because it's not just one charismatic leader. It is a new sense of ethos, a sense of change, a sense of revolution is in the air. We certainly wish them all of the best. If you like this program, please do so by way of smashing that like button. Please leave a comment and let us know your thoughts, where you are tuning in from wherever in the world. And please do share this as well via YouTube and via Facebook. Well, tonight, as per all of the other nights, we are not out of love, we are not out of faith, we are not out of words, but for now, we are out of time. We would like to thank our producers in the background, of course, the executive chair of the Emancipation Support Committee herself, Zakia Uzuma Wadada, Queen Mother, as well as our beloved Queen Sister helping us with the technical aspect of tonight, Renee Francois. With those few words, we say a very pleasant good night, and this has been another edition of Indaba, the voice of the Emancipation Support Committee, the voice of the people, certainly the voice tonight of the Sahelian revolution. With that, a very pleasant good night. Take care.
Good night.
Wow.